Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this month's Brown Bag webinar, and we're so very excited to have Minal Mistry and Peter Canepa together, both from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. As this will be a little duo today, we will be starting off with Minal, who's the Business Initiatives Lead at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, while Peter Canepa is the LCA specialist in their materials management program. So I'd like to welcome you both and take it away.
Okay, so this is Minal. I'm going to be starting the first half, and then we'll hand it over to Peter to elaborate on some examples of LCA and how we go about setting priorities. So thanks EarthShift and everyone at EarthShift for inviting us. This is a good opportunity to talk to folks. The title is Preventing Emissions, and using LCA to set priorities at the state level to talk about or understand where the hotspots are and how might we take actions towards reducing the emissions through all sorts of different actions that Peter will describe in a little bit. I'll open by saying that Oregon is a pretty unique state in terms of how we are positioned in looking at larger pictures for environmental care. We have a state-mandated vision that includes pretty succinctly 3 different topics. First is conserving resources, second is protecting the environment, and third is living well. And this living well aspect is the big bucket, if you want to say. Everything falls into that. So how might we go about improving the lives and quality of lives within the residents of the state by doing conservation and by doing real environmental protection? Typically, government agencies respond to environmental care in terms of emissions or pollutions or discharges that are occurring, and then a response is a legislative approach or some kind of a rule, or we go and help clean up the system. In a limited form, there's also prevention work. With our work, LCA really opens the door to look at prevention in a much robust way. We can look at the entire system and identify where the hotspots might be and how might we go and address those hotspots. So that's how LCA really plays into the environmental care. And it's not a typical approach at state levels to use LCA. So Oregon's pretty far ahead in how we're implementing this process. And so we'll get some examples shortly. I want to start this process by first talking about what do we mean by life cycle of materials. This is an LCA kind of a conversation, but it's a good idea to take a visual and understand what we're talking about. So we're referring to the same kind of a visual in our head when we're talking. First, starting of life cycle of materials is pretty straightforward. Everything we make, use, sell, throw away really comes from the planet. And this illustration is designed to show that extraction of materials, raw materials come from the earth. And starting from that point, there's emissions occurring, whether that's air, to soil, to water, to humans, to wildlife, and so forth. And so this cloud that you see above each of these stages, the extraction piece, the manufacturing, transport, and so forth, is a representation of the approximate size or scale of those emissions throughout that life cycle. Generally speaking, most people don't pay attention to the full life cycle. They think about recycling or buying things that are green and so forth. And so this allows us to start thinking in a big picture manner. As an example, I want to throw this iPhone 6 image. It's a pretty old image, and it's probably down to like iPhone 58 or 59 these days, but the story still holds true. Typically, we talk about where the stuff is made. So in this case, 4 different countries are identified. You've got US, China, Japan, and Korea, I think. But that's not the end of the story. It gives us a false impression that only 4 countries are involved in this production cycle. But when we start digging in deeper, we start seeing that there are resources needed to make those different components that go into a cell phone. And those resources don't come from the same 4 countries that actually made those components. And so here we have a expansion of all the different metals and minerals that go into making a cell phone. And once we start mapping that, we start seeing that a whole different story evolves. We've got a bunch of countries now that are affected by extraction processes. So you've got a lot of countries that are affected through the extraction process. Many people are affected, many environments are affected, a whole lot of wildlife damage and ecological damage. But this is only the mineral part of this cell phone. So this does not include fossil fuels, the other auxiliary systems that are needed, so timber industry, transportation industry, and so forth, that all connects the dots. So in a way, we have a false impression when we just talk about a product and product stewardship, or if we only talk about carbon and nothing else, because environmental harm and hazards are occurring throughout the system. So that's just a quick background to keep in mind as we keep talking about the details of other issues that Peter will introduce and the stuff that we'll talk about. So here I want to start talking about climate change, and part of it is because Oregon has a very deep set of data, pretty robust data that pretty much nobody in the country has, or probably not even worldwide. We have been tracking greenhouse gas in the state for over 20 years, and I'll be showing you two different kinds of inventories that we measure and what those different inventories tell us. And the reason that this title is Lifestyle and Climate Change is because how we consume, how we make things, and what we buy and throw away really dictates the outcome of these kinds of inventories. So imagine this circle is the carbon impact, or the emissions based on greenhouse gas emissions within the Oregon economy. So this is everything that occurs within the state. Imagine the production that occurs, the investment in infrastructure, in public transportation, in making neighborhoods walkable, in changing out lighting systems, fleet management like we've done at DEQ, slowly shifting our vehicles towards electric. All those things that happen within the state is measured in this circle. In Oregon, that represents about 63 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. There's also a second inventory that we track, and this inventory is called the consumption-based inventory, because Oregon depends on a lot of things that are made outside the state and outside the country to live the way Oregonians live. For example, 60% of our food is imported from elsewhere. We grow a lot of agricultural products, but many of them just get exported. So the combination of two gives us a lens into what's occurring in terms of impacts related to climate based on how we live in the state of Oregon. And if we weren't looking at both pictures, we would be missing out on a whole lot of emissions, or we would be not paying attention to them. So that's the intention. So here we have a snapshot for 2015. How might this look like in a trend of a long-term data gathering? We have 20 years of data, so we can start to look at patterns of consumption and patterns of production and patterns of efficiency measures and things like that. So that's our next chart. So this is a slightly complicated chart, so as it's evolving, we'll talk through it. On the bottom, you have a dotted line. That's our state mandated goal, which is to reduce carbon impacts to 90% to the 1990 level. So that's the first data point on the far left. That line doesn't change because that's our target. The blue line that developed, which is like the mountain range, this is where, that's the sector. So that's inside the state of Oregon. So that's the small circle we saw in the previous slide. Here we can see that over a period between 1990 and 2000, there was a rise in emissions. And then it started to taper down, and we're starting to move slightly better and dropping down in terms of carbon impacts. What that shows us is that all the efficiency measures and all the work that the state is doing for making the cities and the streets more walkable and more bike rideable and more public transport investment, and companies investing in efficiency efforts and buying new machinery that's more productive, or changing out lighting and things like that in our homes. All of those things are helping. It's slowly reducing the impacts per dollar spent. So that's a good thing. But the second line, that's the orange line, that's the larger circle, which is showing us the consumption pattern within the state of Oregon. So back in 1990, we're pretty close. The consumption in the sector were pretty close. But as we go forward to 2016, or 2015 was the last data point, we have increased that consumption rate drastically. And what it's also showing us is a discrepancy between the inbound inventory, which is the activity within the state, and then what it takes for the Oregonians to live the way they do, a significant gap between the two. First, all the efficiency gains that we've made in that blue line is pretty much flattened out. So if you look at the 1990 number and the 2015 number, the slope is pretty flat. So what that tells us is, while efficiency is a very important measure, it isn't enough to offset the carbon emissions that are coming out of consumption, meaning all the stuff that we're buying and throwing away from elsewhere. The second thing it tells us is that the gap is expanding really fast. So just after the recession of 2008, a slight increase, so 2.5 times the difference. But then right after the improvement and the recession subsided, we went to a 4x difference between the in-boundary and the out-boundary, meaning the efficiency measure were outstripped by the amount of consumption that we were doing in the state. If you had asked me pre-pandemic a prediction for the 2020 data point, I was going to say maybe 5 to 6x is what we were predicting. But now that the economy has been taking a pretty big hit, not just our own, but globally, I don't know, maybe we'll drop down to 3 or 4 again. But it's a significant piece. Still the message is the same, is that efficiency is not sufficient for us to maintain or even curb carbon. We have to also maintain and curb production and consumption writ large. The same data points, we can also start parsing out where the emissions are occurring. So this first chart shows us that most of the carbon impacts are happening outside of the state of Oregon. So about 2/3 of it is somewhere else. So in other states where production is occurring on our behalf, or other countries where we're buying things from, where they're making things on our behalf. Second is that much of those emissions are happening inside our households. So consumption within families and consumption within our communities is really significant. And it kind of makes sense. What else does this data tell us? So this, when we start parsing the same information out in different sectors, so here we've broken this up into materials, services, fuels, and electricity. Now, in the circular economy conversation, we hear things like, all we have to do is move to service economy and things will be fine. Well, there are some problems. We have to start looking at the data a little bit carefully. So here, materials make up 41% of the inventory and services 26%. And I want to draw attention to this because it's not easy to just shift to services, because services are exclusively, or not exclusively, very well tightly tied to materials themselves. So here are some examples of what's included in these inventories. So in the services side, you have all these things that are listed here. And on the materials side, you have these other things, but they are reciprocal. So for example, construction of buildings are considered construction materials, so those are materials. But the maintenance of buildings fall into the services side, which are not devoid of materials. They still need materials to provide that service. So the point is that you can't just separate materials from services by themselves. Some, perhaps, but not all. And it's not a simple strategy of just let's go move to services-oriented environment, because they are all tied to materials. So anyway, that's a good takeaway here from this same data point. That's almost 2/3 of the, or more, yeah, 2/3 of the data or carbon impacts at the state level for consumption is related to materials and services. And that's a significant hotspot. Next, the same data, when we parse it out into geographic separation, we start seeing that different industrial sectors or different kinds of products that we consume have different levels of emissions in different parts of the supply chain. So the dark blue is within the state of Oregon, the medium blue is other states in the US, and then the light blue is outside of the US. So you can see some of the food and beverage, for example, the impact outside of the state is significant. That makes sense because we import almost 2/3 of our food that we consume in the state. This next data set is, or chart is complicated, so we're just going to walk through it one piece at a time. So the same inventory data that we collected also tells us a story about the final demand per dollar. So this is the per capita demand. The orange line represents 2005 as our baseline. From that, you can see the dark blue, which is 2010 data point. In 2010, we saw a decrease in the demand per dollars. And that's because we were just coming out of a recession. And within 5 years, the demand increased by 17.4%. So that's a pretty big increase when economic swings or upswing. People tend to consume a whole lot more. You might say, well, what happened to the population at that time? Well, the population grew also. In 2010, Oregon saw a 5.8% increase, and in 2015, a 10.7% increase. So factoring the population, what does that look like? We start seeing that once you factor the population in, the demand for 2010 post-recession is increased slightly, but once the economy starts booming, boom, we're up to 30% in the consumption and real dollar demand. The next chart is a positive chart. It shows negative, but it's a positive chart. What this shows is that per dollar spent, the emission intensity, or the amount of carbon that's embodied per dollar spent in the state of Oregon, is actually diminishing. So post recession, it was down to about 2.4, but after the recession, it was about 14.3% decrease per dollar. So that's a good thing. It shows us that efficiency measures actually work and they help. But when we combine the whole story together, what we find is that consumption rose by 11.4% by 2015. And that consumption of the different mix of the goods of services that were in the basket really changed the game. And that's where that 4x difference that I showed earlier shows up from. And so efficiency is very useful, but it doesn't get us there. So consumption and production both have to be part of our strategies and how we maintain and manage that. Next, this chart is a slightly different view of the same thing. This chart is the same data parsed now by household incomes. So here what we start seeing is that the carbon impact of a higher income family is far more than that of a lower income family, which also tells us that in this spectrum of income disparity within a city or within a state, we have adaptability and vulnerability very much separated. So those that are able to adapt are also having higher incomes. They also have a higher impact. But those that are vulnerable are typically low income and not able to adapt. And we're seeing this in the pandemic situation, where you have people who are able to move, like myself and Peter and others, who are able to move towards their home and start working from home and still continue working, while others have to still go in, be dealing with the health consequences and other vulnerabilities simply because they're unable to adapt to financially. And so this tells us that carbon or climate change is not an equal opportunity impactor. It does affect people in different ways, and the strategies that we adopt, whether it's a mitigation strategy or adaptation strategy, really matter, because adaptation is going to affect a specific group of people, whereas mitigation is across the board and helps everyone. So that's important to understand from these kinds of data. Next is I want to show some slides of where the pattern are going for consumption. And so this is data coming not from our own data, but this is OECD data. They have predicted between 2011 and 2016 that as a planet or as a global economy, we're expected to double the demand of all kinds of materials that are being used in the economy. And the list, metals, fossil fuel, biomass, and minerals. So consider this, that the same materials, we're asking the same planet to now produce 2 times the non-renewable materials that we need for consumption. At the same time, each of these sectors that are listed are expected to grow more than 2 times across the planet. So these are the demands we're putting on the planet now. If we start looking at that in the consequences of what happens in a living system, which is the whole Earth, nine different planetary boundaries have been identified. And if you're not familiar with this, a good place to go find and learn about this is the Stockholm Resiliency Institute. This chart comes from there. It identifies 9 different planetary boundaries, and 4 of them have been exceeded. So we've exceeded climate change, we've exceeded the ability for biodiversity to maintain itself, land systems have changed, ocean systems have changed, and on top of that, we have incredible amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus released from industrial agriculture going into waterways and soils. Several of the other categories that are part of this system, such as freshwater use, ocean acidification, and other climate-related aerosol pollution releases, are in questionable state only because we don't have sufficient data to draw the clear picture. That doesn't mean that these things aren't happening. It just means collectively we don't have enough information. On a positive side, one thing that we as a group of humans across the planet agreed on, which was stratospheric ozone depletion. We agreed that it was a problem and we started working together, and we were actually able to correct the problem. We yet have not agreed on climate change. We haven't agreed on biodiversity and things like that, and as a result, they are out of control. So cooperation is a big deal. That's a good lesson from this chart. So first takeaway that I want to shine light on is that overconsumption is a root driver that damages both the environment and social fabric. And what are we talking about here? We have pretty high stakes: climate change, freshwater pollution, and you can see these slides. But what's at stake here is, plain and simple, extinction. It's a ripping of social fabric across the entire planet. It's not just the poor folks, it's everybody. And then finally, what's at stake is well-being across all beings, not just for humans. I want to address some prevailing myths that we hold pretty dear, starting with the first myth that all we have to do is recycle, all we have to do is manage the materials after we're done using them, and that somehow that's going to remove environmental burdens. Well, if we remember ourselves, this whole chart is kind of telling us that there are burdens occurring all the way through the life cycle. So starting with extraction, consumption, or manufacturing, and all the way through to waste. So if we're only focusing on waste, we're not necessarily paying attention to the rest of the system, because just because we recycle something, that doesn't mean something doesn't get made in the economy. Next is that we assume an end-of-life lens doesn't give us the whole picture. We all have houses and buildings and cities where things build up. We have stuff sitting around in closets. We have stuff sitting around in our garages and storage units and so forth. Those things are not accounted for if you're just looking at the solid waste stream to determine your strategies. And lastly, what we assume the planet can produce in a regenerative fashion is a falsehood. At present, the Global Footprint Network has identified and calculated that we are drawing about 1.7 times that of the planet, meaning we're taking up more stuff out of the Earth than the Earth can produce regeneratively. If you combine those data together, what we find is that if you post pre-1950, when most countries were living within their biotic system capacities, the Earth was thriving. Within a lifetime of one human being, we've now gone in 70 years to a struggling planet. We're saying we're at 1.7% or 1.7 times the draw. Within the next 40 years, what OECD and others are predicting is that we're expecting the Earth to act as if there are 3.5 Earths. That's a recipe for a dying planet. And this is something that's predicted within our own lifetime. So these aren't my data. I've just combined them together to create a shocking visual just for the fun of it. I want to also highlight the other myth that happens in society, and that is that recycling is a fix-all. At present, we have significant information that recycling is not a fix-all, and yet a whole lot of energy from both policymakers, popular media, citizens, nonprofits, and industry in particular are driving towards recycling as the sole solution for a whole lot of responsibility in terms of material stewardship. Well, I want to show what is that. If we were able to do full recycling, what does that look like? So remember that chart for consumption for Oregon. If we were to put all of our breakdowns in here, the electricity and fuel would make up about this portion, services this much, and materials this high. If we went in Oregon from the current 40% recovery to 100% recovery, we would be diminishing that impact by about 3%. So even with full recovery, which isn't theoretically or physically possible, we would only reduce impacts by 3%. So strategies have to be put into place that account for material consumption and services that are offered. So second takeaway is pretty straightforward, if I haven't been clear so far, that recycling, while it is an essential bit of materials management, it is not sufficient to get rid of all the things that occur prior to those productions. I'll leave you with the post-COVID question, is that how do we want to contribute to uplift well-being? Because a whole lot of inequities that are occurring in society are now laid bare. And going back to business as usual is probably not a good thing. So what's our contribution there? I'll leave that and hand it over to Peter at this point.
Great, thanks, Minal. So thanks, I want to just shift gears a bit to talk about how we take all this big picture information Minal just spoke about and use it to inform work, specific work using LCA, and then taking this big picture information into action. So, you know, the first thing I want to say is we have a sort of iterative approach, much like life cycle assessment itself, to apply these type of metrics in a way that we're constantly learning from them. So, you know, it's good to know that from our CBEI, consumption-based emissions inventory, where the impacts lie, because that helps us identify hotspots, both in terms of materials and life cycle stages that we can work on and sort of get the highest marginal bang for our buck. And we do prioritize a lot of our work using the CBEI. But just like traditional product-based LCA, you know, this consumption-based approach doesn't tell us whether our current rates of consumption and use and disposal of materials are sustainable in these planetary terms that Minal was speaking about. So this measurement cycle is sort of intended to force us to ask that question, right? To understand what our consumption-based emissions are, to dig into the hotspots using sort of conventional process-based LCA and other lenses like well-being, to conduct projects, and then to feed that back into sort of our statewide goals around planetary boundaries, or at least Oregon's share of those planetary boundaries. So, you know, we know food is a big part of our statewide impact. We can evaluate specific solutions with process LCA. And then we can say, well, how much does that, you know, solution move us towards a sustainable outcome? So before I share some specific examples of our work, I just want to reiterate what Minal was talking about in a simple problem statement. So first, you know, the Earth is a finite system. It has a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of solar gain, and it can provide us with those resources at that finite level. And so our objective here is to use them at a rate that is sustainable in perpetuity. Second sort of part of this statement would be that on the other side of the equation, we need to emit waste below the level that Earth can metabolize and absorb them. So just like resources, the Earth has a fixed capacity for absorbing and handling the emissions of all of our consumption. So this isn't about sort of being less bad or, you know, making something green. It's a sort of budgeting exercise, and the objective should be to live within those limits. That should be, I think, the high order goal we're working towards, and everything else should sort of be a means to an end. And, you know, Minal already described this, but here in Oregon, we've articulated that high order objective in these three terms, that by 2050, Oregonians, produce and use materials responsibly, and therefore conserve resources, protect the environment, and live well. Now, I'm not sure we've fully realized this thinking, and you know, I hope with some of the questions you challenge us to demonstrate that indeed we're trying to place our work within the context of these planetary boundaries. Otherwise, I think we're susceptible of just making something less bad and not, you know, truly sustainable based on my two problem statements. So just to reiterate, I think very quickly here, the way our work has changed is, of course, we're taking a full life cycle approach. We're shifting from just focusing on materials at the end of life as waste, and to reducing all impacts of all materials across their life. And we're looking from just sort of using traditional regulatory tools towards a broader suite of options for reducing environmental impacts within planetary boundaries. So I want to just quickly take you through a few of the novel approaches, and some of these almost seem kind of quaint, so don't laugh, bear with us, but we think they're impactful. For example, you know, we're working to prevent material consumption and waste, so across the life cycle, by working with school districts to promote reusable dispensers for milk. So instead of serving milk in those tiny little gable-top cartons, we piloted a program with Clackamas County to have these milk dispensers. I love that they call them steel cows. And the thing here that, you know, people think, oh, well, you're not just wasting those gable-top cartons. Actually, what they found is that students are wasting less milk because they're able to portion and serve just the amount they want to consume. This was just a really interesting, sort of simple example of waste prevention. Similarly, working with the city of Eugene to promote and create water bottle filling stations at various public accounts. Working with Jackson County to promote the reuse and repair of clothing. Metro, our regional government here in the Portland area, has integrated lifecycle thinking into their regional waste plan, as well as a big effort on well-being and equity. As a fifth example, we, with the city of Portland, have helped them roll out and implement a deconstruction requirement in the city for old homes. So as opposed to demolishing these homes of a given age, a certain age, you're now required to deconstruct and salvage those materials. And it's created a whole new industry, a new skilled labor industry for deconstruction practitioners, a whole new market for reusable materials, for salvaged materials from homes. So it's a really interesting way of preventing new material production and consumption by leveraging the stock we've already accumulated in the built environment. A few more examples here. Promoting refurbishment and fix-it fairs. I mean, this one seems super quaint to me, but instead of now going and buying a new thing when something breaks, like actually trying to fix it and pairing people with, you know, a broken item with somebody who has the skill set to repair it through these fix-it fairs. We've also piloted, or created, not piloted, rolled out a complete EPD program across the state that connects producers of concrete with users of concrete in a handful of ways. It helps the producers create an EPD, and we've worked on the user side, the buyer of concrete side, to help them shape policies that require lower impact concrete mixes. So that's a pretty interesting one. We've done a lot of research on the supply and demand of smaller homes in Oregon. Now, I'm going to talk in more detail about that one. We've rolled out a statewide campaign on preventing the wasting of food. And we've even sort of worked on statewide purchasing agreements to reduce toxics in cleaning products. So that's a vast array, a sort of a smorgasbord there of ideas, but this is just some of how we're trying to move up the hierarchy instead of just focusing on what happens to materials at end of life, towards preventing the creation and wasting of those materials to begin with. So I want to focus on one of these examples in detail to just kind of take you through that measurement cycle process that I showed at the beginning, sort of from LCA to implementation, to kind of show you, you know, soup to nuts how we went about this process. So I'm going to focus on increasing the supply and demand of smaller housing options in Oregon. All right, so we started with an initial research question, which was pretty straightforward. Over the life of a home, a residential building, how can we use fewer materials and or reuse materials? I mean, it seems sort of obvious with the question, well, just make it smaller, but the story is more complicated than that. So we went out and met with stakeholders and brainstormed all these different ways we could use less materials or reuse materials. And then we used LCA to evaluate the efficacy of these different approaches. So this is where the process LCA part of our measurement cycle came in. So for example, for smaller homes, we looked at the benefits of using less material and the benefits of then using less energy to heat and cool the home, and the benefits of that smaller material demand at end of life in terms of disposal or salvage of the materials. So again, the purpose here was, let's just try to answer that question of how can we use less materials by coming up with a bunch of different ways we could do that and evaluating those ways with LCA. This work was carried out with a kind of an interesting coalition of partners here: the Oregon Home Builders Association, the Earth Advantage, which is a state or a sort of a regional green building rating organization, and then we worked with Qantas to do the LCA modeling itself. I think one thing just to mention here that was kind of unique is we did this work shortly after the 2008 recession, and I don't think the Oregon Home Builders Association would have wanted to partner with DEQ on this had that not been the case. New home starts were at an all-time low, the industry was down, and they saw this as a way to, you know, branch out to maybe explore a new type of home building they could do. All right, so in a nutshell, what we learned, and this is old hat for all you LCA practitioners, is that, you know, 2 stages of the life cycle really mattered the most. Whether you made a standard size home or a small home, it was really about materials and operations, and much more so about operations across the life cycle. This is just showing the global warming potential of a large home on average and a small home on average, just to give you a sense of the hotspots here. I think one thing that well, let me just leave it at that. So we knew operations was the big hotspot. We also know those operational impacts accrue very kind of slowly over the life our functional unit on the previous slide, is 70-year lifetime for these homes. And what we also knew is that these material impacts happened immediately and upfront. As soon as the house is constructed, these impacts have occurred, whereas these happen slowly over time. And so we again, we're the materials management program. We don't want to ignore those operational impacts, but we wanted to really focus on that immediate, instantaneous impact that happens when you first construct something. All right, and just sort of digging into detail and drilling down across the different types of scenarios we examined, small homes, different designs, et cetera, you know, we found, things to the right here reflect savings, biggest potential for savings. And we found that smaller homes had the greatest potential for savings generally. And so using this sort of LCA work, and by the way, this whole study is published on our website. Happy to share those links afterwards if you want to dig into the details. You know, what we found is that assuming the same occupancy over the lifetime of these homes, that a smaller home has cumulative life cycle impact reductions across all stages. And that could equate to significant amounts. I mean, up to, you know, maybe a 50% reduction here between this McMansion and an extra small home. And this, I'm just showing greenhouse gases, but this trend applied to all of the impacts we looked at. You know, but of course, at the same time, in addition to the size of the home, you know, there was a correlation with energy efficiency and home size. And there are already efforts out there, green building efforts, to reduce energy consumption through, you know, building codes or green build rating standards, green building rating standards. So, you know, you already saw that within a given size, there's also efficiency gains that can happen due to energy codes or energy efficiency implementation. So, you know, we kind of saw the potential to add to, this was sort of the main way that the impacts of housing was being reduced was through energy efficiency. And that's really important. As we saw, the operational stage was important to the life cycle. But we saw the potential to add to that by promoting small housing. And just to kind of paint the full picture here, at the same time that housing size is increasing, occupancy is decreasing. So here's just an interesting statistic that between 1950 and 2005, the average size of a home has doubled and the occupancy has gone down from a little over 3 to about 2.5 people. So we're building bigger homes and we're putting fewer people in them. And this same trend is true here in Oregon. So this is 1960, and this just advances 1970. You can see occupancy is trending towards, as we approach the 2000s and 2010 here, fewer people make up, you know, 2 or less people are now the majority of the homes occupancy rates here in Oregon. So this LCA work and all that background information kind of led us to say, okay, how do we actually take action? You know, we don't want to just do LCA and that's it. Like, the point here is to hopefully implement something. So how do we use this knowledge on the environmental benefits of smaller homes to do something? Some things had already been done based on the size of homes. For example, Oregon Building Codes Division had implemented size-based tiers in the energy code, right? Promoting better energy efficiency through smaller homes. So some of this happened, but we worked to ensure that this was really codified and promoted in our state energy code. Next, we worked with Earth Advantage, the same partner who helped us do the project, to revise their Oregon-specific green building rating system to allocate points for smaller homes and to revise their rating system to promote material and resource credits differently based on small homes. We convened a working group of multiple stakeholders across kind of a unique set of government, nonprofit, and industry, and even academia, to develop a kind of plan, an action plan to implement and promote and provide information on smaller homes. This group began using the term ADUs, alternative or accessory dwelling units. So I'll use that term interchangeably now, ADUs and smaller homes. So, you know, one thing this working group came up with is, like, we need to promote these. We need to give people a sense of what these smaller homes can mean for them, right? So, for example, envisioning the life of a smaller home, so somebody could see different use cases where they might have, you know, a smaller home on their main property, and that could serve as a rental income. They could expand into it when they needed it, and then maybe they could eventually move into that smaller home and rent their bigger home. So sort of envisioning different iterations and potential uses of these smaller homes. We engaged with the city of Portland to waive permit fees for the construction of smaller homes. And you can see about where that happened here in 2010. As soon as the city waived those fees, there was a vast spike in the number of permits to build ADUs here in the city of Portland. We also worked with a nonprofit here called the Energy Trust to increase and expand their incentive program for smaller homes for ADUs. This working group that I mentioned earlier helped roll out with the Living Futures Institute a whole new conference series called Build Small, Live Large. This is still happening today, to kind of give folks a sense of what this is. And actually, this first conference in 2012 was really well attended. Like 500 people came to learn about small housing. We conducted additional research to kind of survey existing ADU and small home owners and understand about how they were using their home and their experience with it. For example, one question we wanted to know was, what are ADUs being used for? Are they used as long-term residences? Are they used as rental properties or something else? And you know, so we tried to just get a better understanding of the use cases, again, just to start to provide information to interested parties here to meet the emerging demand for new homes in Portland. We worked to develop this website with a contractor. It still exists today. And on this website, you can find out all kinds of really cool information on ADUs. You can watch videos, there's case studies, you can read about zoning and building codes. We developed appraisal guides to help appraisers understand, you know, this new type of housing and how to value it compared to traditional single family or multifamily homes. We also worked with accessorydwellings.org to develop a financing guide to help people get information on how they could find the financing to develop these homes, smaller homes. This is a really cool video. You can find it on accessorydwellings.org, just introducing you to ADUs. This one's called Take the First Step, so you could Google that afterwards. As part of this outreach work, we also organized tours so people could see firsthand what it would be like to interact with and live in these small homes. And then more importantly, we worked with the city codes departments to ensure that zoning codes promoted and allowed for smaller buildings and multiple dwellings on single lots, so that you know, any barriers to this were kind of removed here. And finally, around 2015, our agency was sort of able to feel like we had done all we could. We passed the torch to these other entities to carry on with the promotion and creation of smaller homes to meet demand here in Oregon. So, you know, all of this started with just the simple question, how can we use fewer building materials? So we used LCA to answer that, and it's led to this pretty significant statewide program. So just to summarize, and then I'll stop, and we were happy to take questions. I think one thing that's unique about this project and why I wanted to highlight this one is that, you know, we started with LCA, but we didn't stop there. And I think that's what is really critical to the LCA community, is that we take this great work we're doing and translate it to action. One thing that was kind of funny, our colleague Jordan Palmieri did most of this work. He actually literally took apprenticeships of, you know, roofing experts or carpenters to start to really know, like, how are homes built and why are things done this way? I know that seems crazy, but to really make all those changes, you know, we needed to know the topic really well. Have relationships with stakeholders. I mean, I think what was unique here is we had a kind of an interesting coalition of DEQ, Environmental Regulatory Agency, plus green building incentive programs, plus the Home Builders Association, plus government. So it was really a broad group of stakeholders that made this possible. And then I think, this one's kind of a, one that you may have a hard time enacting with every project, but being opportunistic. This happened to coincide post 2008 recession. And so, I think at the time was right for a new way of thinking, and maybe we can use our current situation to be thinking opportunistically and trying new pathways now. And then lastly, we are not going to be able to do all of this on our own and affect changes. So we needed to embed our objectives with others. The Home Builders Association, they wanted to build homes. Green building rating systems wanted to give ratings to buildings that were lower impact. So we really had to work with and embed our objectives with others. And so I think I'll stop there. I've rambled too long, but hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of how we go from LCA to action for one example. And we'd love to hear your questions. So thank you so much. Here's our contact information. We'd love to hear from you.
Wow, what an amazing webinar you've given us. Thank you so much. I've had so much great feedback from the audience, and I'm hoping I can get through these questions because I've just been bombarded. Thank you. I wish we could have everybody see this video. It's very exciting to see a state agency being so progressive in collecting this kind of data and conducting the LCA. 2 questions. First, I'm curious how intensive the data collection effort is in terms of human financial resources required, and how large a sample is taken from the population for the data. The second question he has is how much uncertainty seems to be present in the data.
I can take a stab at it at the top level, and Min will jump in here if you like. The consumption-based emissions inventory, which Minal shared, is a pretty vast effort. We are looking at total final economic demand. So we're using dollars. It's a sort of an economic input-output based LCA. And I think you saw on Minal's data, we've had 4 years we've done that. And then we've sort of interpolated between years. It's a big effort, but all that financial data is available, and then emission factors by industry code are available. So it's a big effort to do the CBEI, which is why we don't do it every year. Actually, we have one individual who is behind that work. So in terms of your human resources question, it's one dedicated individual who's been cranking that out on a sort of 5-year basis. And then when we get to the process LCA standpoint, when we take that consumption-based emissions inventory and then drill down into the hotspots, that of course varies depending on what we're looking at. So for the green building, small home example, that was a big effort. It took about 1.5 years to collect all the data, to build the models. I'm gonna just demur on the uncertainty question. We're going from economics down to process LCA. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in that. So I'll leave it at that. Minal, anything to add?
No, I think that's a good answer. The uncertainty question will really come into play in very specific examples, and perhaps the LCAs we're about to do may have a different levels of uncertainty, but it's really hard to do that at the economy level because it's all based on, as Peter said, input output and the dollars spent on different sectors and different product categories and so forth.
I have a request that you please provide a link to the home LCA study. So maybe someone can do that while I go to the next question. What about the consideration of social and economic LCA, especially with the small homes? Sometimes the environmental LCA is not enough to tell the story or bring others on board. That being said, looks like they've been quite successful with the rollout of your small homes.
Yeah, so I'll start there, and then Peter can jump in. So sometimes we don't necessarily need analysis. So in this case, as Peter said, the timing was right. So we were in a downturn of an economic shift. New homes were not being built. People were looking for a ways out, and we had this idea. We were doing the LCA. The LCA identified that small building not only benefited the work that we do as environmental agency, but it would also benefit the sector or the industry at the time, which were looking for homes to build, and no one was building homes. That timing was the right thing there. So the social effect was the fact that, well, the industry was struggling, the local economy was struggling, there was still a need for housing, but there was not a lot of space to build into. So infill was a strategy that was implemented. So in this case, a social lens was already provided to us, just by the sheer fact that the economy was not doing so well. So we didn't have a need to venture into doing a specific LCA driven looking at metrics for social aspects. So kind of a opportunistic approach in that sense. But in future, we do have plans to incorporate the social LCA aspect of analysis in different kinds of work. We just haven't had the need in this case.
Thank you. Another quick question is, do you use hybrid LCA or economic input-output LCA?
Yeah, we do both. So the consumption-based inventory that Minal showed is a hybrid of both, a little bit of process LCA and mostly EIO LCA, and then we do quite a lot of sort of traditional attributional process LCA. So a little of both depending on the need, and that maybe I'll bring back up that slide about our measurement cycle. At different stages of that cycle, we're applying kind of different types of LCA to help inform. Let me resume my share here. Right, so, at this level here, we're doing a lot of EIO LCA, and then we'll get down into the process LCA to really understand, okay, for food, what's the biggest material or hotspot or life cycle stage? So both.
And how do you measure consumption in households?
Minal, you want to do that one?
I can take a stab. So yeah, this is once again it's a economy level spread, and we know the consumption through our in just the economy expenditures, where that expenditure is occurring, whether it's in businesses or in governments, and so it's delineated that way. I don't really have a detailed answer to that. I can look it up for you, but I'll stop there, I guess.
That's fine. So someone says, Peter, Minal, this was fascinating. Do you have any thoughts on how we can reduce consumption?
So that's a bold question, and thanks for asking. This is something that's right before us. We're in the process of, several of us have been working on a state-level consumption strategy for a number of years. Consumption is a scary thing. And approaching it from a state level we have to take cautious steps to not scare people into thinking that we're trying to shut down the economy. The point is to understand where the hotspots are and how might we change behaviors so that we're consuming in a way that actually helps both the environment and the goal of living well. So for the examples that Peter shared about the food, where he didn't elaborate on it because we focused on building, but in the food sector, we are working extensively at reducing the impacts of food in terms of how we're purchasing, but also in terms of the waste itself. So how might we engage citizens or residents for a behavior change in terms of what is purchased, what is discarded, educating them in terms of where the impacts are occurring in that life cycle, working with producers to giving incentives for changing practices for processing, and working with farms and the Oregon Food Bank, for example, to have a seamless flow of food items that are not going to get sold. Typically, they get landfilled. And so finding routes that take advantage of that embodied stuff that's already been invested and preventing it from going into waste. So many different approaches. And it's consumption writ large occupies a lot of stuff, but we're focusing on small things that we can validate through LCA and other tools to help us guide in that direction.
Maybe just to add one thing, I think how to reduce consumption is to first acknowledge and measure that consumption is impactful, right? I mean, I think a lot of Oregonians don't even make that connection. And not to pick on Oregonians, a lot of us don't make that connection. So just acknowledging it and building capacity to understand that is where we're starting.
And I might add one more thing that's in the popular context is that while we talk about consumption as a distinct activity, consumption and production can't really be separated, right? Those are tied. And as my life cycle loop shows, there's impacts everywhere. And just focusing on the purchasing and lack of disposal or prevention aspect is not sufficient. And a good example is recycling. We focus so much on recycling, and yet recycling is a symptom of overproduction and overconsumption. But we don't actually acknowledge that as a symptom of overproduction and overconsumption. We treat it as if it's a solution to something related to consumption. So changing mindsets is a big part of consumption. And as Peter said, identifying and acknowledging it is a starting point. And sometimes even that's scary.
Yeah, so this is sort of a consumption follow-up question. How will we deal with the tension between the desire for more sanitary use via single use versus the less environmental impact of bulk solutions? You know, examples, steel cows and water dispensers, etc.
Yeah, I mean, is obviously contemporaneously an important issue. You know, I think there's a time and a place for reusable options, and a pandemic is maybe a time where we consider, you know, public health as more of a primary objective. So that being said, I think there are many ways we can ensure public health is maintained and while promoting the use of reusable things. So you know, it's not an either or. I guess, you know, we want to be flexible, but of course, by taking, I guess the point that question highlights for me is that by just looking at the environmental lens, we are missing the full picture. And so the question before about social and economic LCA is a good one. I mean, we need to not just say, what's the carbon footprint and make all our decisions off of that. We need to be more comprehensive and look at multiple criteria. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and on that same question, I think part of it is also to question the disposability of things for the sake of disposability and convenience. And we really haven't questioned that as part of production problems or as part of marketing issues. Those are separate from the well-being and what we're facing with the pandemic and safety and health and other issues that are continuous. So drawing the line of saying, okay, something is disposable and it's useful for health concerns and not passing on viruses and things like that, but making that a wholesale way of life is also questionable. To just dispose things because it's convenient, that's something that we've, as my Earth picture shows, that started in about 1940s, 1950s, and it's accelerated to everything is convenient, everything is disposable. Well, that's going too far. The pendulum has swung to where, and as Peter sometimes says, well, do we ever ask, is this product even necessary? Well, if the answer is yes, then disposability is fine. But if the answer is maybe or no, and yet it's still made and marketed and sold and turned into regular behavior, well, that's a problem. And we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, okay, I think I'll have this be the last question, which is rather long and challenging as well. Consumption-based emissions and life cycle are indeed a much more analytical approach we should be advocating in circular economy. As we join 57 countries in the ISO TC 323 circular economy standards development process, where a values-based approach is being advocated over a CB and LCA approach, how can we best convince skeptics that an ICO circular economy standard should not be a recycling 2.0 end-of-life only effort?
Well, I might take a quick stab at this. So I'm not unfamiliar with circular economy. I've been engaged in that conversation for a good 5 years or so. When we speak of values-based, I think that's a interesting choice of words, because, you know, values to Peter and I as an environmental agency actor is looking at a big picture. We are charged with looking at the state level, and that's why we titled this subnational. But values when you're talking about a company, or values when you're talking about a specific product manager, becomes a very strange and different thing. And most of those values are about income or product profit generation. It's not necessarily looking at the lens that we're applying, the well-being lens, the social equity lens, and so forth. And I think those values are not necessarily aligned in circular economy. The circular economy has 3 different high-level overarching goals, as Peter had said earlier. And those overarching goals aren't necessarily being met through their implementation of sort of, let's focus on recycling, let's focus only on closing the loops of the materials. Because as if there's one thing we've identified in our presentation, is that consumption is outstripping those closed loops, and recycling is not sufficient. Because as one of our colleagues, David, likes to say, there are only some things that you want to loop. What about mercury? It's very dangerous. Do we want to keep looping that in our economy? Probably not. So I'll stop. It's just rambling kind of an answer, but I think circular economy is kind of a rambling kind of a conversation. So,
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for a fabulous presentation. We've had overwhelming comments from our listeners, and please, listeners, you have their contact information. You can continue, perhaps, a conversation with them. So thank you again, and I'm going to end this webinar. Bye now.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.